Imagine a country whose economy just suddenly explodes, like growing by nearly 500%.
Yeah, a total transformation.
Right. A place that adopts modern technology faster than almost anyone else on Earth, completely rewiring its entire infrastructure in basically a single generation.
Which is incredibly rare to see happen that fast.
It is.
Yeah.
But now, I mean, imagine that exact same country is, mathematically speaking, slowly disappearing.
Right, shrinking from the inside.
Exactly. Its birth rates are plummeting so fast, and the population is aging so rapidly that the core structure of the whole society is entirely unbalanced.
It's a massive paradox.
It really is. And today, we are taking a deep dive into 15 pages of raw, undeniable data that prove these two completely contradictory things are happening at the exact same time.
Yeah, and it's a phenomenal paradox, honestly, because, when we usually try to understand the history of a nation, we get completely distracted by all the noise.
Oh, for sure. The politics, the daily news.
Right. We look at the political elections, the cultural movements, whatever is trending. But the source material we are diving into today, it just strips all of that away.
Completely strips away.
We are looking at this academic, expert-level presentation outline built entirely on macroeconomic, demographic, and environmental data sets. And this covers Spain, spanning all the way from 1960 to 2024.
And what I find so fascinating, like before we even look at the numbers themselves, is the instruction given to the designers of these slides.
Oh, yeah. The design mandate is intense.
It's brutal in its simplicity. The mandate is a pure white background, no 3D effects, no gradient shadows, no distracting clip art anywhere.
It's just the data.
Just stark left-aligned text. And this quiet, dark, gray timeline running across the bottom of the page from 1960 to 2024. The data is just completely naked.
Which forces you to confront the reality of the numbers, right? You can't hide behind a flashy graphic or a 3D pie chart.
No, you really can't.
But why this matters to you, listening right now, is that by decoding this specific set of data, you aren't just learning some historical trivia about Spain.
Right, it's bigger than that.
Much bigger. You are actually looking at a predictive blueprint. This data tells the universal story of how a modern country transitions from a traditional mid-20th century industrial society into a highly digitized 21st century welfare state.
It's basically a masterclass in how to read the future of your own economy. Because, let's be real, the structural shifts happening in this data are likely heading straight for your own backyard right now.
Oh, absolutely. They're already there in many places.
Yeah. And the executive summary of this presentation, page 2, it doesn't hold anything back. It immediately sets up this 4-pillar narrative. They break it down into an economic leap, a demographic worry, a technological jump, and a green transition.
And those are really the 4 interconnected engines of any modern state. I mean, it's how a country generates its wealth, who exactly makes up the workforce, the tools that workforce uses to connect, and finally how they power those tools without completely destroying their environment.
Right.
You really cannot fully understand one of those pillars without seeing how it is constrained or, accelerated by the other 3.
So let's get right into the first pillar, the macroeconomic leap, because the data tracking the accumulation of national wealth here is just staggering.
It's a massive jump.
Yeah, the presentation shows this low saturation, dark blue 2D area chart on slide 3, and it shows this sweeping upward trajectory of real GDP per capita. Sweeping right through the middle of the chart is this bold, unmistakable red dashed arrow pointing sharply toward the sky.
The visual is very clear.
It is. We're looking at a climb from roughly 5,975 to nearly 29,245.
And that is a near 5-fold expansion in real wealth. But to really grasp what that means, we need to look at the specific metric they're using here. They're measuring this in, quote, constant local currency.
Right. Let's pause on that because it's a really critical distinction for people to understand. If you just look at your own grocery bill from, say, 20 years ago compared to today, the numbers look wildly different.
Oh, completely different.
But that doesn't mean you are suddenly 5 times richer just because the numbers are bigger. It just means the currency lost value. That's inflation.
Exactly. Or rather, that's the illusion of growth. When economists use constant currency, they are essentially scrubbing that illusion out of the data entirely.
They're adjusting for the inflation.
Right. They adjust the historical numbers to remove that distortion. So this 5-fold multiplier we are seeing on the chart isn't just a trick of the math. It is an actual, tangible increase in the real economic output and the physical purchasing power of the average citizen. It means more actual goods, better housing, access to advanced services, and just a fundamentally higher standard of living.
It's the difference between a country where a family might, I don't know, struggle to afford a single car,
Yeah.
to a country where that exact same family takes international vacations and has multiple digital subscriptions.
It is a complete transformation of lived reality over just a few decades.
And the data gives us a huge clue as to how this happened, because there is this crucial footnote attached to the year 1999 on the presentation.
Yes, the euro adoption.
Right. It notes the irrevocable euro conversion rate adopted by the EU Council, which was €1 to 166.386 Spanish pesetas.
That conversion marker is basically the hinge upon which modern European economic history turns. Conceptually, that moment represents a fundamental alteration in the country's financial DNA.
But I mean, how does changing the currency actually generate wealth? Isn't it just swapping out the paper in your wallet for different paper?
It is so much more than that. Integrating into the euro area meant tying their national economic fate to a massive, unified continental market. Before this, countries had to constantly worry about exchange rate risks when trading with their neighbors. Like if you were a Spanish company selling goods to France, currency fluctuations could wipe out your profit margin literally overnight.
Right, because the peseta might drop against the franc.
Exactly. But by adopting the euro, that friction vanished completely. It brought deep structural reforms, access to massive stable capital markets, and a level of macroeconomic certainty that allowed businesses to plan decades into the future.
So they could finally make long-term bets.
Yes, that sustained upward angle of wealth accumulation we see in the red arrow, that was the direct result of deep integration into a broader European economic engine.
Okay, I hear you, but let me push back a bit here.
Go for it.
If this integration was so magical
Yeah.
and the growth was so structurally sound, why does the very next piece of data look like a total catastrophe?
Wow, slide 4.
Yes, slide 4. Because the chart shifts here. We move from looking at GDP on an area chart to looking at this incredibly minimalist combination line chart tracking adjusted net national income per capita.
Right. And right around the year 2008, the designers have drawn a massive glaring gray circle. And inside that circle, the income line hits a peak of about $23,090. And this is calculated in 2015 constant US dollars, by the way. And then it just snaps.
It plummets.
It completely plummets. It's a cliff edge.
Yeah, that gray circle is the brutal reality check of the global financial crisis. And to understand why the designers deliberately shifted from GDP to adjusted net national income here, we really have to pull back the curtain on how economies are actually measured.
Yeah, please translate adjusted net national income for me because that sounds like a mouthful.
It is, but it's crucial. Think of GDP as your gross salary. It looks great on paper. It measures the total economic output of the entire country.
Like the big vanity number.
Exactly. But net national income is a much closer proxy for the actual money winding up in the pockets of the citizens because it accounts for something called the depreciation of capital.
Depreciation of capital. Okay, give me an analogy for that.
Sure. Imagine you own a house and your gross salary is $100,000 a year. Okay, sounds good.
Right, but this year, your roof starts leaking, your car transmission blows out, and your laptop dies.
Oh, that's a bad year.
A terrible year. You have to spend $20,000 just to replace and repair the things you already own just to keep your life functioning.
Right.
So your gross salary was $100,000, but your lived prosperity, the money you actually have available to buy new things or go on vacation, is much lower. That is capital depreciation.
Oh, I see.
When we look at a whole nation, roads wear out, factory machinery breaks down, buildings need constant repair, adjusted net national income subtracts all of that maintenance cost from the total. It is a measure of actual lived prosperity.
So it's the money left over after paying the societal maintenance bill.
Yes, exactly. And that peak of $23,090 right before 2008, that was the high water mark of a massive, heavily leveraged economic expansion. In Spain, this was profoundly fueled by an unprecedented construction and real estate boom.
Right, the housing bubble.
Capital was flowing in, buildings were going up everywhere, and on paper, everyone felt incredibly wealthy.
Until the music stopped.
Until the global financial system completely seized up. When the 2008 crisis hit, it didn't just cause a mild recession, it structurally fractured that specific growth model. The real estate bubble burst, construction halted, and suddenly, the perceived wealth just evaporated.
And you can literally see it physically in the data. The line drops agonizingly deep, and then it is followed by this incredibly long, grueling, slow repair period that extends well into the 2010s.
It takes years,
It takes years just to claw back to where they were before the crash.
which perfectly illustrates a core economic truth, you know? Macroeconomic cycles are not just abstract theories, they are visceral.
Yeah, they hurt real people.
When that line on the chart plummets, the mechanics on the ground are devastating. Credit freezes, banks stop lending, small businesses that rely on loans can't make payroll, so they have to close.
And then people lose their jobs.
Exactly. When businesses close, unemployment skyrockets, especially youth unemployment. Everyday citizens experience a severe, immediate contraction in their real purchasing power. It is a trauma that takes a full decade to metabolize.
It really is a sobering reminder. You can have half a century of five-fold historical growth, but a sudden massive shock to a leveraged system can wipe out a decade of progress for the average household just like that.
Absolutely.
But it also creates a really fascinating narrative transition for this outline, because how does a country maintain its status as a high-income nation, and how does it eventually rebuild after a shock like 2008?
Well, it has to rely on its internal engine, its workforce.
Right. It relies on its people to innovate, to produce goods, to provide services, and crucially, to pay taxes.
Yes, the taxes are key.
But what happens to that recovery effort if the population itself is fundamentally shrinking?
That is the existential question that haunts basically every developed nation today, and it brings us right to the second pillar of this deep dive, the demographic time bomb.
Yeah, and the data visualization for this on slide 5 is incredibly stark. It's a dual-line chart. We have a dark gray line representing the mortality rate, the crude death rate per 1,000 people.
Right.
And then we have a lighter gray line representing the crude birth rate. If you look at the left side of the timeline, back in the 1960s, the birth rate line is floating high above the death rate line.
Lots of babies being born.
Exactly. But as time moves forward, that birth rate line goes into an absolute free fall. And right where the two lines finally crash into each other, the designers have placed this glaring bright red highlight.
Demographers and economists refer to that intersection as the death cross.
I mean, it's a terrifying term. It sounds like something out of an apocalyptic sci-fi movie.
It is heavy, but honestly, the mathematical reality justifies it. Let's look at the mechanics of those numbers. In 1960, the crude birth rate was sitting at 21.7 per 1,000 people.
Okay.
That is a robust, expansive population. That's a society having enough children to not only replace the aging generation, but to actively grow the workforce year over year. But if you follow that light gray line to the recent data points, it suffers a cliff edge drop, plunging all the way down to a mere 6.7 per 1,000.
That is less than a third of what it used to be.
It's a collapse.
And meanwhile, the death rate line has just been doing its normal thing, undulating quietly between 8.0 and 10.4 over the entire half-century. It hasn't spiked. People aren't suddenly dying faster. They just stopped having kids.
Right. And what's fascinating here is that this data comprehensively covers the entire national territory. The footnotes specifically point out that this includes the Canary Islands, Ceuta, and Melilla.
So it's everywhere.
Exactly. This isn't just a localized urban phenomenon happening in Madrid or Barcelona. It is a nationwide structural collapse in fertility. The death cross isn't a theory or a future projection. It is the undeniable empirical marker that an era of natural population shrinkage has officially arrived. The society is fundamentally contracting from within.
But why? I mean, we just spent 20 minutes talking about how the country got 5 times richer. If people have more money, better housing, and a higher standard of living, shouldn't they be having more kids, not fewer?
You would think so.
It feels completely counterintuitive.
It does seem counterintuitive until you look at how a modern economy actually changes the mechanics of family life.
Okay, unpack that.
In a traditional, agricultural, or even early industrial society, children are often an economic asset. They can work on the farm, they can help in the family trade, and they are essentially your primary Social Security policy when you get old.
Right, you have kids so you don't starve when you're 70.
Precisely. But when a country undergoes a massive macroeconomic leap like we saw in Section 1, when it urbanizes and shifts to a service economy, the equation flips completely. Children transition from being an economic asset to being an immense economic liability.
Wow, that's a harsh way to put it, but yeah.
It's the economic reality. In a modern city, space is incredibly expensive. Education is demanded for much longer periods. The cost of daily living is high.
Yeah, kids are expensive.
Very. Furthermore, as women enter the workforce and gain economic independence, which we will discuss in depth shortly, The opportunity cost of having multiple children becomes incredibly steep. You are asking families to sacrifice years of prime earning potential and career advancement.
Wow, okay.
So, ironically, the wealth accumulation we saw in the first section is actually the very mechanism that drives the birth rate down.
That makes me think of a seesaw on a playground.
Hmm.
For decades, you had a bunch of heavyweights on the new birth side, keeping the whole structure tilted upward, driving this continuous growth and expansion.
Right?
But over the span of a single lifetime, almost all the weights on that side of the seesaw have mysteriously vanished. The momentum is totally reversed. The whole structure is completely unbalanced now.
And when a societal seesaw tips that drastically, the immediate consequence isn't just that, elementary schools have fewer students.
Right.
The immediate consequence is a crushing, invisible weight transferred directly onto the shoulders of the working age population. Which brings us to the concept of the dependency burden.
Yeah, let's look at slide 6. The presentation illustrates this with a 2D step chart, drawn with really heavy, thick lines in a single tone. It tracks the old age dependency ratio, which is essentially the ratio of elderly people to working age people.
Exactly.
And on the right side of the chart, there is a steep upward arrow. The numbers go from 12.6% back in 1960 to absolutely smashing through the 30% barrier in the latest data.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we need to translate those percentages into the daily reality of the tax-paying citizen.
Please do.
Let's imagine a microeconomy of just over 100 people. A 12.6% dependency ratio essentially means you have about 100 active, income-earning workers supporting roughly 12 or 13 retirees. Let's call it a ratio of about 8 workers to 1 retiree. That is an incredibly comfortable, highly sustainable ratio for a national pension system. The tax burden required to support that 1 retiree is spread so wide and so thin across the 8 workers that no one really feels the pinch. The system runs at a massive surplus.
Right, everybody tosses a few bucks in the pot, and the retiree is totally taken care of.
Exactly.
But the data shows it crossing the 30% barrier recently.
Breaking 30% changes the math entirely. It means society has shifted from having 8 workers supporting 1 retiree to having roughly 3 workers having to generate enough surplus to support 1 retiree. Or, to put it another way, 10 workers are now carrying more than 3 retirees.
That is a staggering difference. Just physically, that's a huge burden shift.
It is. It pushes the Social Security apparatus, the healthcare networks, and the general tax base to their absolute breaking points. The economic energy required just to care for the elderly begins to consume a larger and larger share of that national wealth we saw being generated earlier.
So the money isn't going to growth.
Right. You aren't investing in new infrastructure anymore. You're just trying to keep the pension checks from bouncing.
Man. Which perfectly sets up the third massive theme of this data dive: the price and promise of the welfare state.
Yes.
Because with the pension system stressed and the population aging so rapidly, the state has to step in heavily to care for its citizens. And I want to look at exactly how much that is costing.
It's a lot.
The data zeroes in on healthcare expenditure on slide 7.
It uses a minimalist, scattered trend chart tracking current health expenditure as a percentage of the total GDP.
And the trend is just an undeniable climb. We start on the left at roughly 6.8% of GDP, and as we move through the decades, tracking right alongside that aging population we just talked about, the expenditure steadily climbs until it hits a massive peak, pushing right past the 10% mark.
10% of an entire nation's gross domestic product is a colossal reallocation of resources. Think about the scale of that. 1 out of every $10 generated in the entire country is going into hospitals, pharmaceuticals, doctor salaries, and elder care facilities.
It seems like a simple cause and effect, right? You have an aging population that gets sick more often, so medical bills naturally go up. It's basically a defensive reaction to a population that is slowly breaking down.
That is part of it, definitely. But viewing it purely as a defensive reaction misses the larger economic strategy.
Wow, so?
In a mature welfare state, this level of spending is also a vital active investment. It is the massive capital required to maintain a high Human Development Index, or HDI.
Elaborate on that for a second. How is spending money on end-of-life care and quote-unquote investment in the economic sense?
Because it's not just end-of-life care. A 10% expenditure means you are investing in advanced medical technologies, massive universal coverage networks, preventative care, and chronic disease management for the entire population.
Ah, okay.
You are essentially buying quality of life and longevity. You are keeping your aging workforce healthier for longer, which means they can stay economically active, or at least independent, rather than requiring full-time state care at age 65.
That makes a lot of sense.
It is the hallmark of a society that has actively decided that the immense wealth generated during its macroeconomic leap should be spent on human well-being. It is a feature, not a bug, of a civilized society.
Okay, I understand the nobility of it, and the HDI argument makes total sense. But let me play devil's advocate here for a minute.
Got it.
If 10% of the national treasure is being actively funneled toward the elderly end of the age spectrum, what about the shrinking youth population?
That's the critical question.
Right, the ones who are actually expected to do the working and the innovating. If those three young workers are the ones carrying the burden of that retiree, how is the state investing in them? Because if you don't equip the youth, the whole system just collapses.
And that is the critical counterbalance, beautifully illustrated in the very next data set on slide 8.
Yeah, this slide is striking.
The presentation uses a slope graph to compare the initial years of the data set with the latest years, specifically looking at the gross enrollment ratio in higher education.
A slope graph is such a great visual tool here because it cuts out all the noise and just draws a straight line from point A to point B.
Exactly.
And here, that line points straight to the sky. The numerical shift highlighted in bold black text is massive. Higher education enrollment skyrocketed from under 60% to over 94.5%.
That jump to 94.5% represents what sociologists call the massification of higher education.
Wait, if 95% of kids are going to higher education, doesn't that just completely dilute the value of the degree?
Well,
Are they actually learning skills for a knowledge economy, or are we just creating the most highly educated baristas and retail workers in Europe? Because I know underemployment is a real issue when literally everyone has a diploma.
that is a very valid critique, and credential inflation is a real side effect. When everyone has a degree, the degree itself obviously ceases to be a competitive differentiator.
Right.
However, you have to look at the alternative. We discussed the country's transition out of a traditional industrial society earlier. The factories of the 1960s are gone. The manual labor jobs have been automated or offshored.
Yeah, those jobs just don't exist anymore.
You simply cannot compete in a 21st century global economy, especially with a shrinking population, if your workforce only possesses a high school education suited for mid-20th century assembly lines.
So even if some end up underemployed, the baseline intellectual infrastructure of the country has to be elevated just to stay in the game.
Exactly. This deep, systematic accumulation of human capital was the ultimate safety net. It provided the core intellectual infrastructure necessary for Spain to transition into a highly productive, knowledge-based service economy.
Okay, that makes sense.
If you only have 3 workers to support a retiree, those 3 workers better be incredibly productive. They need to be engineers, software developers, advanced medical technicians, and financial analysts. They need to generate high margin value, and mass higher education is the only mechanism to even attempt that.
All right, so we have a youth population where 94.5% are highly educated, hyperproductive workers. That makes logical sense.
Right.
But there was a massive hole in this narrative that I still can't get past.
What's the hole?
The sheer physics of the labor force. Even if every single young person is a hyperproductive genius with a master's degree, a birth rate that drops from 21 down to 6 still means you have a massive, unavoidable fiscal labor shortage.
It's just simple math.
Exactly. There just aren't enough human bodies entering the workforce to replace the ones retiring. You can't run a booming national economy on just a handful of smart kids.
Yeah.
Where on earth do they find the extra workers to actually power this new service economy and keep the GDP growing?
They found them by dismantling historical barriers. And this leads us to what I believe is the most profound structural shift in the entire data set on slide 9. We move to the social restructuring of the labor market.
That's this. This is a dual line comparison chart showing labor participation rates.
Yeah.
We have a line for men and a line for women. But the designers have filled the physical space between the two lines with a gray shaded area.
Right.
And as you move from 1960 toward 2024, that gray gap physically visibly narrows. It is a mathematical picture of converging equality.
The historical context behind those data points is staggering.
It really is. The female labor participation rate starts from an incredibly low baseline of around 33%.
Only a third.
Think about what that actually means for a second.
Yeah.
Only a third of women were participating in the formal labor force. The vast majority were entirely excluded from the measured economic engine of the country.
Right, they were working, but it was unpaid domestic labor, not formal economic participation.
Exactly. But over the decades, that line surges upward, crossing the 53% mark and fundamentally closing that massive historical gap with the male participation rate.
This raises an important question, though. How did this societal structure adapt to this?
I look at this chart, and the analogy that comes to mind is it's like a household suddenly transitioning from a single income to a dual income.
Oh, that's a good way to look at it.
You don't just double the money, you completely change the consumption patterns and the very structure of how the household operates.
That is the perfect analogy because it scales up beautifully to the national level. Moving from 33% to 53% participation isn't just an economic statistic, it is a total rewiring of society. Think about the mechanics required to make that happen. If millions of women are suddenly entering the formal workforce, who's taking care of the children? Who is managing the household?
Suddenly, you need a massive childcare infrastructure. You need convenience foods, you need dual cars, you need entirely new service industries to spring up just to support the fact that both adults in the house are working 40 hours a week.
Exactly. The enhanced economic independence of women is, arguably, the most significant social structural achievement in the country over the last half-century. It required massive shifts in cultural norms, legal frameworks, and institutional support.
And from a cold, hard economic perspective,
Mhm.
it was the exact lifeline the country needed at the exact right time.
It was the absolute salvation of the macroeconomic leap. That surge in female labor participation directly offset the demographic shrinking of the overall workforce.
The timing was impeccable.
It was crucial. Just as the natural birth rate was plummeting and creating that labor void we talked about, millions of highly educated women entered the formal economy. It was this specific influx of talent that actually allowed the newly formed knowledge-based service economy to flourish.
Wow.
Without bridging that gender gap in the labor market, the economic engine would have stalled out completely under the weight of the aging population. You literally could not have built the modern state without them.
Okay, let's take a breath and take stock of where we are. We have a country that has accumulated massive wealth, survived a brutal housing and financial crash, and is facing down a severe demographic aging crisis.
Right.
But it has countered that demographic crisis by heavily funding a welfare and health system,
Yeah.
massifying higher education to 94.5%, and unlocking the immense economic potential of female labor participation.
They have built a highly educated, highly modern workforce.
But a workforce is only as good as the tools they have at their disposal. What tools are these modern workers actually using to drive this knowledge economy forward?
The digital layer.
Yes. That brings us to my favorite part of the data, the digital society.
Slide 10 and 11.
Here's where it gets really interesting. The geometry of technological adoption here is fascinating. We are looking at a classic S-curve tracking internet penetration alongside a bar chart tracking mobile cellular subscriptions.
S-curves are beautiful mathematical structures, particularly when applied to sociology and technology.
Break down how an S-curve actually works for someone who hasn't stared at one lately.
Sure. Imagine drawing the letter S from bottom to top. It starts with a long, flat tail at the bottom. This represents the early days of a technology, when it is experimental, clunky, and highly expensive. Only the early adopters and specialized institutions have it.
Right.
Then, as the technology becomes cheaper and more useful, the curve hits an inflection point and goes almost completely vertical. That is the phase of mass adoption where everyone is rushing to buy in. Finally, the curve levels off at the top, forming the top of the S. That represents market saturation, where practically everyone who can own the technology already does.
And the data here is a textbook S-curve. Back in 1990, the bottom flat tail of the S, internet penetration in Spain, was at a microscopic 0.01%.
Basically nothing.
It was practically a rounding error, just a few university mainframes and hardcore tech enthusiasts. But then the curve goes vertical. Today, it sits at over 95.7%.
The speed of that shape is what is so remarkable. That curve proves that the digital divide, the historical gap between those with internet access and those without, was completely flattened in the span of a single generation.
Just wipe out.
Going from 0 to 95.7% is total societal transformation. It means the infrastructure was built, the devices were purchased, and the population learned how to use them all in the blink of an eye, historically speaking.
And the mobile phone data on slide 11 pushes it even further. The bar chart for mobile cellular subscriptions shows an absolute explosion post-2000. The designers included this horizontal baseline marker set at 100. That means 100 subscriptions per 100 people. One active device for every single human being in the country. But the data bars don't stop there. They smash right through that ceiling, peaking at over 127 devices per 100 people.
That data point 127 per 100 is the mathematical proof of what sociologists call a state of hypersaturation.
It sounds excessive. Why does a society need more phones than people?
Because the nature of work and life changed. It means people have a personal smartphone, a dedicated work phone, a connected cellular tablet, a mobile hotspot for their laptop. It proves that the country hasn't just merely adopted technology as a novelty, it has deeply, inextricably immersed itself into a mobile digital society.
I want you to really think about what a 95.7% internet adoption rate actually means on the ground for you, the listener. How does that change the mechanics of a country?
It changes everything.
It means that digital infrastructure is no longer a luxury, and it's no longer just a niche sector for IT professionals. It is as fundamental to the daily functioning of the nation as the paved highways or the running water.
Think about the gig economy, instant digital banking, remote work capabilities. You practically cannot access government services, pay your taxes, or enroll in that 94.5% higher education system without a digital connection. The digital layer is now the primary medium through which the entire knowledge economy operates.
It is the central nervous system of the modern state.
Precisely.
But wait, I'm thinking about the physical reality of all this. A central nervous system that runs on an S-curve of 127 mobile devices per 100 people, powering a modernized service economy, requires immense, unimaginable amounts of electricity just to keep the servers humming and the lights on.
Oh, absolutely. The power draw is massive.
How does a nation fuel a 21st century digital society of this scale without bankrupting itself or triggering an environmental catastrophe?
Which is the perfect segue to the final major pillar of our deep dive, the green dual track of energy and the environment. Because having a highly educated, deeply digitized workforce is completely useless if the energy required to sustain them is economically volatile or environmentally destructive.
Yeah, that makes sense. And to illustrate this, the data on slide 12 presents a really powerful juxtaposition of two charts. We have a 100% stacked area chart highlighting the expansion of renewable energy using dark and light gray contrast.
Right.
Right next to it, on slide 13, is a downward trendline chart tracking fossil fuels. Yeah. And when you look at the data sets side by side, they form a perfect mirror image.
The symmetry is striking. Let's look at the mechanics of the grid substitution.
On the first chart, non-hydro renewable electricity generation, we are talking solar, wind, biomass, climbs out from being a microscopic footnote in the data to expanding its footprint to account for over 40.9% of total electricity generation.
That's a huge leap.
It is a massive wedge pushing its way through the chart. And conversely, on the second chart, fossil fuel consumption systematically crashes down from its historical high of over 81%.
That symmetry is the empirical proof that real structural energy substitution is actively occurring. This isn't just a country adding a few solar panels on top of an ever-growing pile of coal to look good on paper.
Right, that's not just greenwashing.
Exactly. The dark, carbon-heavy energy is being actively physically pushed off the grid by the green energy. This proves a firm national strategy for energy independence and low-carbon growth.
The mechanics of that must be incredibly complex. You have to shut down centralized coal plants and replace them with decentralized wind farms and solar arrays, all while ensuring the 95.7% digitized population never experiences a power flicker.
It requires a massive influx of capital. But in the electricity sector, it is at least technologically straightforward. You change the power generation source, but the electricity flowing to the consumer's wall outlet remains exactly the same.
Okay, I'm glad you brought up the idea of it being straightforward, because I need to challenge this clean green narrative.
Just here.
I am looking at slide 14, tracking carbon emissions specifically from the transport sector, and it tells a very different, much uglier story.
Yes, it does.
This chart does not have a beautiful, smooth, downward trend line. It shows transport emissions surging up, hitting a massive peak at 116 million tons of CO2 equivalent, and then it just stubbornly fluctuates. It bounces up and down erratically.
It's messy.
If the country is so committed to a green transition, why didn't transport emissions crash smoothly like fossil fuels did in the power sector?
Because you were looking at the absolute friction of decarbonizing the physical world. As we just discussed, swapping out a centralized coal power plant for a field of wind turbines is a centralized institutional decision. The transport sector, however, is notoriously difficult to decarbonize because it is completely decentralized.
It's the difference between changing one massive power plant and trying to change 20 million individual car engines and commercial diesel delivery trucks.
Exactly. Those erratic fluctuations on the transport chart represent a fierce, ongoing tug of war.
A tug of war between what?
Well, on one side, you have the increasing macroeconomic activity we've been discussing. More wealth and more digital commerce inherently requires moving more physical goods and more people around the peninsula. You order something online with your mobile device, a physical truck has to deliver it. That macroeconomic growth pulls emissions up.
Right. More activity equals more carbon. And on the other side,
On the other side, you have the slow incremental improvement in internal combustion fuel efficiency and the gradual lagging rollout of new energy vehicles trying to pull emissions down. But it relies on millions of individual consumers making the choice to buy a new, expensive electric car. It is a chaotic, messy transition compared to the clean lines of the power grid.
it really highlights how difficult it is to change the physical infrastructure of a country versus the digital infrastructure.
Absolutely.
So we have all the pieces on the board now. We've traced the massive 5x accumulation of wealth and the deep scars of the 2008 financial crash.
Yeah.
We've seen the brutal mathematical reality of an aging population crossing the demographic death cross. We've looked at the required massive investments in healthcare and the massification of higher education.
The societal shifts.
We've witnessed the structural salvation provided by female labor participation, the absolute hypersaturation of digital connectivity, and the messy but undeniable transition toward renewable energy.
It is a massive amount of contradictory data to process.
It is. So how on earth do we synthesize 64 years of macroeconomic, demographic, and technological shifts into a single roadmap?
The authors attempt exactly that on the final page of the outline, the grand synthesis.
And fittingly, on page 15, the designers drop all the complex charts, all the axes, and just leave a stark, minimalist four-quadrant infographic, 4 text modules summarizing the entire journey.
It brings it all together.
So what does this all mean? Let's look at the 4 quadrants: economic resilience, population challenges, and the dual-track green and digital engines.
If we synthesize all this, the data paints a picture of a nation that has successfully navigated deep structural trauma. The economic resilience quadrant acknowledges that despite the devastation of the 2008 financial crisis and the painful period of capital depreciation, the structural foundation of the economy held. A new equilibrium of income and consumption was eventually found.
But the population challenges quadrant is the flashing red light on the dashboard.
It is an existential threat.
Yeah.
The low fertility plus high aging trap cannot be ignored. The math of a 30% dependency ratio simply does not forgive.
Right, the 3 workers supporting 1 retiree.
Exactly. The data suggests this must be actively managed. If the internal birth rate remains at 6.7, the only mechanical way to sustain the workforce is through aggressive immigration policies and deep structural fertility incentives.
And to carry the massive economic burden of that aging population, the future is entirely reliant on those last 2 quadrants, the twin engines driving the country forward.
Yes. The 95% digital connectivity rate and the 40+% renewable power grid. Spain's transformation from a traditional, insulated industrial base in 1960 to a highly digitized, mature welfare state today is a testament to incredible structural resilience.
Truly.
They built the human capital through mass education and gender equality. They built the digital nervous system to make that human capital exponentially productive. And they are aggressively building the green energy supply to power it all.
It really is a masterclass in how to read the underlying climate of a nation's trajectory. And I want to remind you, the listener, that while these 15 slides are explicitly built on Spanish data, the blueprint is universal.
Yes, it applies almost everywhere.
Every major developed economy is wrestling with this exact same demographic seesaw. Every economy is trying to manage the hypersaturation of technology while navigating the messy, real-world friction of the green transition.
That's the challenge of our era.
By understanding the mechanisms behind this data, how a service economy requires mass education, how female labor participation can save a shrinking workforce, how capital depreciation affects lived wealth, you are vastly better equipped to understand the structural shifts happening right now in your own country's economy.
The specific data points will vary, but the
Yeah,
mechanics of the transition are the same everywhere.
absolutely. And as we wrap up this deep dive, I want to leave you with a fascinating contradiction to mull over on your own. Something that emerges when you overlay these final pieces of data on top of each other.
Oh, this is a good one.
We spent this whole time talking about how the shrinking workforce needs technology to do the heavy lifting. The digital S-curve and the green energy grid are framed as the twin engines meant to carry the heavy economic weight of that aging population. They are the saviors of the modern economy. But what happens when the digital infrastructure itself begins to require massive, unprecedented amounts of physical energy? As we move from simple mobile connectivity into an era of AI-driven data centers, the power demands of a 95.7% connected, hypersaturated population are going to soar exponentially.
They are going to skyrocket.
Will the newly built green grid, currently sitting at roughly 40% renewable, actually be able to scale fast enough to support the ravenous energy appetite of the digital engine? Or will the two engines of the future ultimately collide with each other, with the digital engine crushing the green one?
It's a huge question.
It is a tension between the digital abstract and the environmental physical tension hidden right there in the minimalist white space of the data, and something for all of us to watch very closely in the years to come.